Hey everyone, thanks for spending Valentine's Day here. We're going to have Chloé Cooper Jones, who is a philosophy professor and now nonfiction professor at Columbia and journalist based in Brooklyn. She's a contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine, a Whiting Creative Nonfiction Grant recipient, and in 2020 was a finalist for the Pulitzer in feature writing. Her memoir, Easy Beauty, was a New York Times notable book of 2022, US Today's #1 nonfiction book of 22, Vulture's #1 memoir of 22, among other things. Come on up, Chloé. I guess I'll read a little bit.
How's this? Can you hear me? Good. Hi, I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for spending your Valentine's Day with me. I love you. Um, I'm really honored that Robert Lopez asked me. He's been just like such an inspiration to me as a writer for so long, and I met him through sort of admiring his work. So it feels like an incredible full circle moment that I would get to be here because of my work. So thank you, Robert, so much. Okay, let's see. If I, how's that? Can you still hear me? Am I too far? Is that good? Okay. So I'm going to read just a little section actually from the end of the book. And if you haven't, if you haven't read this book, the only thing you really need to know is that each chapter I'm in a different city. I'm trying to figure out a way to sort of change something about myself. And I do that by leaving home and sort of searching for a way of understanding what the experience of beauty could be to sort of change something about myself. And at the end of the book, I've come home to Brooklyn, where I live. And the two names in this section are Wolfgang, my son, who in this book is just turned 7 and now is 12, which is wild. And so he's 7 here. And then his father, Andrew, who's my husband. Okay. Wolfgang and I stand below a sulking sky. He's done with school for the day, but wants to stay on the playground with his friends for a while before I haul him off to the bodega and then home. I let him have 10 more minutes and watch him hurl his body around a jungle gym. He plays easily and happily with other children. Clouds form above. They make shapes upon which I can force a category: pig, shoe, hat. But the categories don't stick. Shapes dissolve. Reality remains in restless motion. It was beautiful. It was beauty, this engagement, this grasp and release, this brief but real discerning of the fleeting and how it redirects my focus from myself and out toward the world. We get our groceries. Wolfgang clutches a frozen pizza to his chest on our walk home. What shapes do you see in the clouds? I ask. Just a bunch of Pikachus, says Wolfgang. After dinner, the three of us go out on a walk. Everyone knows us. The ladies at the pharmacy give Wolfgang a sucker. We get a bottle of water from the bodega, and Wolfgang sits on the ground petting the familiar cats. Nail salon, Chinese takeout counter, laundromat. At the edge of Prospect Park, we see a sign for a magic show. We should go, Andrew says. I don't know, says Wolfgang. What, aren't you curious? Curious about what? Wolfgang shrugs. Someone doing tricks and pretending it's magic? But maybe this time it will be magic, says Andrew. Maybe it'll be the best thing we've ever seen. Wolfgang reluctantly agrees, and we walk to a field where many young children, close to his age, sit on the grass in a circle around the great moody Trudy. I recognize a few of Wolfgang's friends from school, and I tell him to go sit with these kids, but he refuses, and he stands in the back at the edge of the crowd next to me. The great moody Trudy waves her hands over a fishbowl, drapes a cloth over it, says a few magic words, removes the cloth, and reveals a fish swimming there. The kids clap and cheer, but Wolfgang is unimpressed. The fish was in the base of the bowl the whole time, he says. The great Moody Trudy starts another trick involving a newspaper. She pours clear water onto it, and then she wrings it out. The water is green. The newspaper ink is food coloring, says Wolfgang. The great Moody Trudy balls up the newspaper, then launches into an impassioned speech about the environment and the importance of not littering. She leads her crowd with a hand cupped behind her ear. Let's hear it, kids, she says. This newspaper should not be left in the grass of this nice park. It should be put in the... And all the children shout, trash. And Wolfgang covers his face in disbelief and whispers, recycling, these idiots. The great Moody Trudy pours lemonade into a cup, starts to sip, and then pretends to trip, and out comes glitter everywhere. There was never lemonade in that cup, says Wolfgang. She does a trick while juggling balls. One disappears. I saw her palm it, says Wolfgang. Tell her, Wolfgang, I say. Tell her you are not fooled. Andrew glares at me. I know how you're doing this trick, says Wolfgang, loud enough for everyone to hear. And I pull Wolfgang close to me. He reaches up to hold my hand. We are united, safe, apart, against the scene, but together. The final trick involves a stuffed rabbit going on a journey. The rabbit, we're told, goes into a forest of happiness and emerges with a key to a secret box that will unlock the real rabbit. The great Moody Trudy lifts a box and puts it on a pedestal. She pulls a drawer out to show that it is empty. The drawer has a false back, says Wolfgang. Where is he? Where is the real rabbit? Asks the great Moody Trudy. Is he in this drawer? No, all the kids shout back. Yes, he clearly is, says Wolfgang. Tell her she's busted, I say, nudging Wolfgang, and we both crack up. Tell her you've got her all figured out. Andrew grimaces. Stop that, he says to me. Promise me, says the great Moody Trudy. Promise, fingers in the air, everyone. Promise me you won't tell anyone if I reveal to you the secrets of my trick. I don't owe you that, says Wolfgang, and we high five. Chloe, Andrew says, stop, don't. He's smart, I say. Look how smart he is. He's figured out all the tricks, I say to Andrew. Okay, says the great Moody Trudy, time to meet the rabbit. And she knocks on the false backing of the drawer, and Wolfgang smirks and begins to say, see, I told you so. But then the backing collapses, and the whole box collapses, and there is no rabbit there at all. And Wolfgang stops and stares. The great Moody Trudy holds up a stuffed rabbit and says, I guess there was no real rabbit after all. Wolfgang's face falls. The great Moody Trudy starts to put the stuffed rabbit back in her jacket, and then, with a flourish, she takes off her jacket, swings it around in the air like a cape, swishing it between us and the stuffed rabbit, and when she pulls it back, a real one sits sweetly in her hands. The crowd erupts, Wolfgang too. He's enthralled. He's seen something magical. How did she, I can't, where is it? Where was it? He says, beaming. See, not so smart now, you cynical little jerks, says Andrew. The great Moody Trudy waves the children forward, offering to let them pet the rabbit. To my surprise, Wolfgang darts forward to join the line, and without a trace of self-consciousness, stares up with a face full of wonder at the great Moody Trudy and tells her she is the greatest magician he's ever seen. He pets the rabbit gently and then nuzzles it with his nose, and the great Moody Trudy leans down and they embrace. We stand at the edge of the park and watch Wolfgang play with the other kids. Andrew asks me, when Wolfgang was standing in the back of the crowd with us at the magic show, do you know what I thought? What? I say. I thought, Andrew continues, I went to school dances and I did not dance. Oh, I say, neither did I. As kids, we'd both been compelled to derail experiences we felt excluded from. We'd believed and placed all our self-worth on the notion that to assert yourself against the crowd was a form of higher level thinking, which sometimes it was, and sometimes it was cowardice. We'd not been great at seeing the difference, but Andrew is better about this now, and I am learning. I didn't participate, he says, and it might have felt good to be united with my peers, but I missed the chance to find out. Right, I say. I look at Wolfgang, and I see someone smart and kind, says Andrew. I want him to be critical, but not at the expense of camaraderie. His compassion and his intelligence are complex enough to allow for both if we just don't what, I say. If we just don't get in his way. Oh, it's working now.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So the first thing I wanted to ask you about was, so knowing you through this book, you were doing this PhD in philosophy and all that. And I was wondering, did you ever think you would write a memoir or expect to be on this train?
No. Okay. No, I mean, I was a writer and I did an MFA actually in fiction, and I always wanted to write, but I also felt that it was really, I had like an instinct that I didn't have the right sort of foundation of knowledge from which to write something. So I felt like it was very important for me to study for a period of time and to work really hard on my craft. And so I did multiple degrees that are unnecessary, but were fun and got me health insurance, which is very important. And I did a PhD in literary theory first, and then in philosophy. And then I was working as a journalist for a period of time. And then this book only came, I never thought I would write a memoir, period. I thought maybe I'd write other things, but never something like this. But it came into existence just because I was really recognizing this way in which the problems with how I interacted with other people were starting to show up in my son's behavior, which if any of you if you have kids or you spend a lot of time around kids, they do this very rude thing, which is reflect your behavior back to you. And so that was painful. And I recognized a lot of the worst things in myself were showing up in the way that Wolfgang distrusted strangers or felt as though he was really struggling to be like united with his peers. Or that there was like a place for him with his peers. And I knew that he was learning that all from me. And so as I was working as a journalist, I was, and doing my second PhD, I was just traveling a lot. And I started writing because I'm a writer. And so I process everything verbally. I was just sort of writing about this problem for myself, like not to publish. I mean, never to publish. I don't come off very great in this book. So it was not the wisest way to introduce myself to a public, but I was just writing to try to solve this problem within myself. And then I ended up publishing a short little section of it in The Believer. And that piece, I just got so many letters after that piece came out. It's a little bit of the Lake Como chapter, if you've read the book. And suddenly I felt as though the thing that I was trying to figure out in myself had resonance beyond my story through this like unbelievably gracious outpouring of responses from readers. And then the book grew from that, much to my surprise. Yeah.
Yeah, that was sort of what I was going to ask, because I couldn't imagine you went on that Italy trip knowing like, this is my memoir.
No,
so got to write this for the memoir.
no.
Great. So as far as one of the things I really liked in this book was you sharing some of the philosophy and history that was there any pressure to put that like in footnotes or to do that in a different way? Or was it always just the way it was sort of as part of the narrative?
Yeah, it was a hard sell because I was like, okay, I'm gonna write this memoir, but a lot of it's gonna be about Kant. I'm gonna have a big section of Kant in there. And that it's like not all that appealing to anybody. But And I did have, I was lucky enough that when this book went out on proposal, I had the ability to have meetings with several editors. And there were many editors who just, I was so grateful to be put in a room with so many brilliant people who really believed in my vision and trusted me. But I did also have editors who bid on the book who said, I love this book. We'll bid on it, but I want it to all be chronological and just start with your childhood and work up to now. And please cut all the philosophy stuff. You'll alienate everyone. And I really felt strongly that this piece of philosophy in the book was just essential because for a lot of reasons. One is that I was doing a philosophy PhD, so I was genuinely just authentically immersed in this work. It was my entire life. It would have been like trying to write about my life, but not mention Brooklyn or something. It's like, no, I live in Brooklyn. I'm reading this, thinking about this. So I couldn't really access my authentic processing mind without talking about what I was engaged in intellectually. So that was one side of it. But then the other side of it is a lot of this story is about feeling as though you don't have many mentors or models or a place with people. And I think maybe something many of us can identify with is we search sometimes as artists for community, we have a heart sometimes. Maybe you guys were very cool and popular, but I have searched in my life for community and I've not found it all that often, or I didn't find that as a child in school or in Tonganoxie, Kansas, where I grew up. That wasn't where I found my community. I found it in books. And so it was a very natural thing for me to, when I was trying to access a new way of thinking, that I would turn to the only mentors that I really trusted, which was writers and thinkers and philosophers. So it would have just felt really untrue to who I was if I had cut that part out. So it was pretty easy to just say, no, I got to do it this way.
Well, I love how accessible I felt like all of that stuff was, which is great.
Yeah.
Let's see, what do I have here? And so it begins with this scene, the prologue, where your two classmates are talking, saying really fucked up things. And then we don't find out until 50 pages later what they were actually saying.
Mm-hmm.
Is that always how you had it written, or what made it?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a couple very intentional structural choices that I make throughout the book about where I reveal pieces of information. And that is a particular choice where there's a very short prologue in which I talk about these two men saying, arguing about whether or not a disabled life is worth living. And that comes up sort of initially in this prologue. And then I very intentionally withhold for a period of time, just what not that long, I think it's on page 12 or something, what my body looks like. Because I want the reader to meet me on the page as a mind and a person processing the world first. And then very importantly to this book as a body as well. So I don't withhold that for too long. But it's very important to me to withhold the sort of full nuance of the conversation with these men for a period of time. Also, after knowing me and following me through some things, because the beginning, the arc of the book is largely about me feeling very against others, and then trying by the end of the book to find my place with others. And another sort of important arc of the book is understanding that people are always more than the worst thing that they have said. They're always more than the worst comment that they've made to me or the most insensitive question that they have asked. And the sort of true, I hope, beating heart of the book is this movement toward the ability to see people as much more complex, as whole, and how if I'm going to ask for that for myself as a disabled woman, to be seen as a person whose life is very full, very worthy, and has great value, instead of what's argued at the beginning of the book that it's inherently lesser, then I also need to be able to see that in other people. So this chapter later, where you get the full conversation, is a chapter in which these men who maybe in the prologue seem a little bit like villains, I think actually get quite fleshed out, and they're much more empathetic, real people. And you learn about Colin's sort of inner turmoil, and this feeling of like this false dichotomy or this false syllogism that he tells himself, that like through his depression, if anything else happened, he would feel like he's already he barely can believe that life at all is worth living. So seeing me, he builds a sort of false syllogism of like, oh, but if that happened, it would definitely be, but it's actually, of course, far more about him than it is about me. So it's not that he's let off the hook or that he's completely exonerated or something in that chapter, but I think he becomes a much more vibrant, full character, and your assumptions about him get tested at least a little bit. And it was so important. I think I do the same thing with my father. He's presented in a much more sort of difficult way, and then is made more nuanced and complex. And it's all to say that it's very important that there are no villains in this book. There are only people who at times the fullness of their humanity is a little more difficult to engage with. But that is more true of me than it is of anyone else. Like, I'm by far the worst person in this book. So that's that sort of arc of Colin's character, is to get readers to sort of actively revisit him and see him again in a little bit more of a complex light.
Yeah, and I saw the same thing with the character of Sharon, how she was introduced.
Absolutely.
Yeah. What else? So did you, by the time you started writing the proposal and speaking with agents and editors, did you know what the full arc of the story would be, or did you figure that out as you?
No, because one of the best things about nonfiction is that you can just sell a proposal and be like, I think it's going to be this. Novelists, the novelists in the room, you can't do that pretty much. Like, pretty much have to have the whole thing written. That sucks for you. And yeah, so I wrote a pretty long book proposal. It was 5 chapters, and they were pretty episodic. I didn't have the whole arc. And then I had a 25-page introduction letter that spoke to what I thought the themes of the book were. And I sold that January 2020. And then my plan was to revisit all these places throughout 2020 and write the book. But you may remember that wasn't going to be possible. So this book is so much about traveling out in the world, but the actual like sentences were written in my Brooklyn apartment, like sort of just like as cloistered as possible. Of course, I took so many notes while I was traveling and I was working on this problem, but basically everything in my proposal got rewritten, as I was really deep into the book and could see it through. So I had the great fortune that nonfiction writers have of having a contract and the sort of security of that, but also time to really like work through the whole arc. And I had an amazing editor who was with me the whole, every step of the way. Yeah.
It's amazing because it really feels like you're in each of these places with you. So it's great. So can you talk a little bit about your experience in Cambodia and Chetra? That was some of my favorite parts. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that chapter comes at a very important part of the arc of the book, which is where I'm really at my lowest point. It's like the dark night of the soul. If you say screenwriting, it's the dark night of the soul sort of portion of the book. And I think that it's a very important moment in which I recognize that a lot of the like reductive impulses that I feel I have experienced in my life as a disabled woman that have been like reflected back to me. It's very easy to sort of adopt an attitude of like, other people are doing these things to me, right? Like people, like strangers are cruel and unkind. I'm the good person. They're the bad, like it's easy to sort of build that mentality. And I needed this book to have a moment in which I am recognizing that these reductive impulses are universal and are human, and that I am no more like protected from those impulses than anyone else. I'm as capable of being sort of reductive or being, especially in Cambodia, this thing of like being fascinated by tragedy. And I'm trying to filter this through like a philosophy question, which is Aristotle's paradox of tragedy. And I'm also trying to imagine that just because, Cambodia, a lot of Cambodia's GDP is generated by Western tourists coming to look at sites of genocide from the Khmer Rouge. So a lot of Cambodia has set up like really like trauma Disneyland, and it seems very obvious that it's like geared toward our curiosity, like to Western curiosity. And I was trying to write about this from this like distanced intellectualized space of interrogating Aristotle's, just making up like theory, like, looking like Aristotle would think this about the killing fields in Phnom Penh. But really, I, of course, am not distanced from it. And I'm visiting these sites just like anyone else. And because I think I'm a field reporter and observer, I think that I'm somehow separated from this desire to look at tragedy and to form opinions about people as though they were othered from me. And of course, that's exactly the thing that I feel has happened to me my whole life. And here I am doing it too. And of course, that section is really designed to show like a deep empathy for many ways, like the people who've hurt me the most or the people who have othered me the most, that there's something in our human nature that does that automatically. And it's a really important thing to like, if I'm asking for people to think about more critically how they respond to disability, I have to also ask myself those same critical questions, even if it puts me in my most sort of in the light that I don't want to be seen in the most,
Yeah, it was really powerful. And especially the ending of that chapter of them just wanting to go to a Ferris wheel or roller coaster, like anyone else.
Yeah.
So throughout the book, I know your struggle and your father's struggle with like wanting to escape reality and just finding escape. And then so by the end of the book, it's sort of finding easy beauty in your regular life. Do you feel like that change is still with you, or is it still something that kind of comes up?
Oh yeah, like the challenge.
Yeah.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, because I'm alive. So yeah, I mean, I really dislike memoir. When I was thinking about writing this, I of course was reading lots of models and especially like identity models. And a lot of the books I read, I really didn't like at all. I was really mad about because a lot of writers, especially with, and I understand this, I have empathy for this, but they are writing a lot of times when people are doing life writing, they're writing from the authority of hindsight. And so a lot of what you get is sort of this story of like, I did everything right. Everything is fine. Everything, like, here's what happened to me. And here's how I handled it really, really well. Because they're past that moment and they processed it and they're like seeing themselves in they're either seeing themselves in the best light or they're very wisely self-protecting because our brains are actually completely set up to self-protect. So they're just doing what their brains are telling them, which is like, don't make yourself the asshole in your book. Like, don't do it. And that's fine, but that's not very helpful to me. And I don't really learn as much from that. And I think a lot of writers of memoir also struggle to find a resolution at the end of their book where they're like, here is the lesson I've learned, and now I'm really happy. Everything's good. I crossed the bridge, and then later I married somebody there, and we're all happy. And I look back at the trail. I'm referencing a specific book, maybe you know, and everything's good. And that's great. Maybe that's great. I don't know, but I'm still alive. So everything's not good. Everything's still like real and in motion. And I really wanted to write a book that was actually about the struggle to change something about yourself, and to not write it as if that struggle were over or fixable, or that like the challenges of a particular coming into being magically end when you've like gone on that trip, or you know, I don't know, seen a sunset and like, oh, they're all, you know, all those problems are gone. And so the book is very intentionally written in the space of struggle. I mean, I read from the end of the book in which I'm still doing the same behaviors of like wanting to self-protect and keep my son away from the crowd. And the book ends not with me like resolving that perfectly, but just me gaining a little bit more awareness of the problem. And I think awareness is agency. So to me, maybe that's not a thrilling arc to you all. I don't know, maybe you haven't bought the book and I'm not selling it well, but I think it's like a very thrilling arc where it's just simply you know, this is Vivian Gornick's line. She wrote so many great things about nonfiction, but her line is like, a memoir ought to be an incoherent self at the beginning, being a slightly more coherent self by the end. And that arc is actually pretty radical and pretty thrilling. And I really agree with that. So all the struggles that are in this book are still present, but I do think I am a slightly more coherent self. I think I have a slight like increase in awareness, and I have more agency, and I hope I get to keep trending that direction.
Yeah, one of the ways you showed that through with the neutral room, which shows up in the beginning and then by the end is sort of going away. So it shows growth.
Yeah. Well, I'm still in the neutral room all the time. I mean, the neutral room is a place, you know, so at the beginning of the book, I talked about this thing called the neutral room where a doctor taught me about this neutral room as a method for controlling pain. So I have a pain disorder. So my doctor, when I was little, said anticipatory pain. The brain is like such an amazing thing. Anticipatory pain can be real pain. So he said part of what you need to do to control like a pain disorder is figure out a way to go into a mental space that just keeps you in the present and stops you like spiraling about what pain is to come, because that actually creates pain in the body that does not help you. So he said, find this neutral space in your brain. Nobody can come in there. He called it the neutral room. Mine has gray walls in my mind. There's no windows. And he said, just count to 8. And when you're in a lot of physical pain, you just count to 8. And that's all that there is in the world, is that 8 count. And then the 8 count starts over. And I learned that distance athletes do a very similar thing. So like when distance athletes are, you know, running marathons, quite often they're not saying wisely, they're not going like, I gotta go 26.2 miles really fast. Like that sounds awful. But instead, a lot of times what distance athletes will do is they'll be like, I am only running to that bench. There's nothing beyond that bench. And then they get to the bench and they go, I'm only running to that, you know, that tree. I'm only, and then so I have to talk about tennis for a second because Maya Robert and I love tennis. But there's a lot of athletes, tennis players that you'll go into, I did tennis writing inexplicably for a year. And because I could. And a lot of people will say like to athletes in press conferences, they'll be like, when you were at that second set, did you know that you had to do this because that, you know, and a lot of times the athletes will be like, no, I was just playing that one point. There's actually nothing beyond that point. I'm just trying to win that point. Then I got to win that point, and I got to win the next one. And so it's like a way of not getting overwhelmed by how far down you are. And this is like a really common thing in athletics. So I was taught this as a method for managing pain or the sort of anxiety that can come with anticipatory pain. And in that way, the neutral room is a tremendous source of agency, and I keep that part. The problem is that I started using that like separated space when I was in situations of social pain that actually required my presence. And so I think that the thing that's fascinating about the neutral room is that I really think we all have our own version of the neutral room. My father says in a letter that's quoted in the book, "Where do you go to escape the pain of reality?" So I go into this neutral room, and to withdraw, to escape the pain of reality can, in certain circumstances, be, of course, like a tremendously necessary thing to do. It can be a space of rest. It can be a space of recharging and getting yourself ready for the fight, whatever that may be. But of course, if you stay in that retracted space too long, it becomes a place of complicity or of absenting yourself from responsibility. And so I think the book is really, it's not about leaving the neutral room, but it's about recognizing that threshold in which something that can both serve and protect you can, once you cross a certain threshold, be a place of too much self-protection and abstention from presence in life. And I think everybody has their own version of that, whatever that may be. And minding that threshold is like, that's kind of the work of growing up. Yeah.
Were there any memoirs or books that were helpful to you in writing this or figuring out the structure? Or...
Yeah, I mean, everything Vivian Gornick. I think she's just one of our greatest living writers. A book that I felt so inspired by and just recently taught to my students is Helen Macdonald's H is for Hawk. I don't know if anybody's read that. They're making a movie of it now. I just saw that was just announced like 2 days ago. It's probably going to be awful. Because the book is so beautifully written, and it's like, don't make a movie, just have Helen Macdonald read it out loud. But maybe it'll be great. I don't know why. I'm just scared because I love this book so much. I'm already going to this apocalyptic place of that it'll be a bad movie. It'll probably be amazing. See, this is when I have to go in the neutral room to start like from spiraling. I just think that book is like an absolute work of genius. There's some books that were really different from what I was doing, like extremely different, but really inspired me, like Sarah Broom's The Yellow House, which I think is a masterpiece, has completely different aims than mine. All the work of Leslie Jameson, who I've been a huge fan of for so long, and now is unbelievably, I share office with her at Columbia. It's like one of the weirdest things of my life. I just sort of like stare at her too long, like, oh. And yeah, Margot Jefferson, who's also at Columbia, I think is an absolute genius. So those were a few writers that I think, especially on the prose level, I was really, really deeply passionate about. But also, this is memoir adjacent at least, or I think it's memoir, but I grew up reading travel writing and loving travel writing. And, I grew up on a horse farm in Tonganoxie, Kansas. So I needed to visit other places in my brain. And I love travel writing. And I really feel that this book, Easy Beauty, is a work of travel. It's a travel log. And it was very important to me to write something that felt like it was in conversation with the travel writing that I grew up on, because of course, in the travel writing, like the canonical travel writing, it is largely men. And it's men who, don't really need a reason to go. They're just like, I think I'll go outside and go to a mountain and like have some big thoughts. And I think everyone will want to know about them. And then they just write them down. And I was like, I want to do that. And then the genre of travel writing was like, no, you can't do that. Like you're a little disabled lady and a mother. And then I was like, I'll do it. And I'll just have my thoughts. Like I'll just look at a lake and my thoughts down, and I lost the Pulitzer for it. It's like, I've lost the Pulitzer a couple of times, but I have to stop with my thoughts. Maybe that's why. But I mean, I think that this book is like very importantly an entry into that genre as well as memoir, very intentional entry.
It must have been nice to go to all those places during COVID, or in your mind at least.
Yeah, I went right before and then,
And then to live there.
yeah, and then I imagined them on the page. Yeah.
Great. Well, let's get some questions from the audience here.
Thank you for your questions, Meryl. I appreciate it so much.
Awesome.
Hi. How do you deal with anxieties, I guess, or fears around writing about people in your real life in a not necessarily flattering light? And I guess attached to that, how have you dealt with the anxiety of writing about yourself in that same way?
Well, I didn't show my book to anybody but my editor. And so they just had to deal with it when it came out. It was already out, it was on a shelf. That's not a mature way to go about it. But it was like, it was the only way I could go about it, because I think that this book is so vulnerable. It was very, very difficult to write, that I really couldn't invite anybody else into the process. Now I'm writing 2 more books for my same editor at Simon & Schuster, and I'm handling it very differently now. The second book I'm writing, my mother is a major character in it. And I've really had to talk to her a lot and really be much more transparent with her about how I'm telling her story. And I feel a greater obligation to really including her in the process. But I think that the way that I sort of grapple with the very tricky question of like, what are the ethics of writing about someone else, is that I'm not actually writing a book about me or anybody else in my life. This is what I'm striving to do. Whether or not I actually accomplish this, who knows? But this is what I'm really trying to do. Is I'm trying to remember that I'm not writing a book like about me. I'm not writing a book about my family. I'm not writing a book about any real people. I'm writing a book about what I hope feels like a universal idea about what it means to be alive and want to change something about yourself. And the details of my life are only avenues to that greater thing, because the details of my life are utterly meaningless to anybody outside of like the small circle of people that love me. So if I'm going to take this book out of that circle and put it out into the world, then I need to make sure I'm actually it's not about me. It's about like being in a body and trying to figure out what it means to reconcile the fact that your interior life and the way that people receive you based on your exterior or external appearance are in profound conflict. And like, what's the pain that causes? How does that shape a person? And if it shapes you in a negative way, can you change it? And that to me feels like a question worth asking, not for me, but for like humans to like alive. Like we should ask ourselves these, or like maybe it's helpful to like spend 300 pages thinking about this like deeply human thing of the mismatch and the conflict between our interior like truth of self and this way in which the world receives us. And so I think that if your work is really aiming at that, the people in your life who you write about to get to that aim, like hopefully they understand that and they trust you. If the aim of your writing is to like spill all the dirty secrets of your family's life, like, you know, then they're pissed and they should be pissed, you know, but if you're like, no, it's for truth, then they kind of get in line. That was my experience. Yeah.
Thank you.
First of all, your coat is great. I've just been staring at it the whole time.
Oh, thank you.
That's not my question.
Can I just share something? So as if you've read the book, you know, I was raised by a very frugal Midwestern farmer, teacher, and she really doesn't like to spend money on anything. But this coat I feel proud of because it's fully reversible.
Oh.
So it's actually 2 coats, which means that no matter what I paid for it, it's a bargain, right?
Yes.
That maths, yeah.
The way I do math. Sure.
Pockets, like it's fully reversible. It's 2 completely different jackets. Okay.
That's great. No,
Thank you. Thanks for humoring me.
Yeah, I love it. So I loved the book, and the best part, or what I kept being like impressed by, was the way that like the structure throughout just seems like everything follows itself like in a very natural way, but we're going back and forth through time and through countries. And to hear you talk about it, there are very like important structural choices that you made versus like, delaying information. And then you wanted like travel writing. It seems like you had a lot of big ideas about it. Did you find that impeded your writing, or did everything just sort of fall into place because of all the different ideas you had about it? Does that make sense? Is that a real question?
I think so. I mean, I think the way that I would respond to this is just by saying like, and you tell me if I'm answering your question.
I'm not sure what my
Okay, well, I'm gonna speak into it. I don't know if this will resonate with all of you, but I know for me, like when I started writing as a young person, there would be certain things that I would like, certain aspects of the writing craft that I would get a lot of praise about, or that would just feel really fun to me. Like there's certain things in writing that feel really joyful to me. If we were to imagine, this is obviously a totally made up number just for my point, that there's like 10 essential points of craft. There are, of course, many more than that, but let's just pretend that there's like 10. And that 10 is like skill in setting, skill in plotting, pacing, syntax, musicality in prose, character, tension building, whatever. Okay. So let's pretend there's 10. I think if we're really lucky and we're really great writers, maybe one of those comes naturally to us. Maybe half of one of those comes naturally to us. And if that does, like you get this sort of like euphoria from that. For me, that's setting. I mean, it's always been setting in place. And I just get such a jolt from like thinking about how certain things are possible within setting. But then this thing happens where you're like writing your joy and your passion and the thing that feels good, then you've got a lot of praise and then you show up in Robert's class, right? And he's like, hey, great setting. Have you heard of a plot though? Do you know what plots are? Have you thought about character development? Or is everyone just going to be the same the whole way through? Like, have you thought about dialogue? Have you thought about scenes? And you're like, Robert, I like setting though. And he's like, cool, but this is not what writing is. Like writing is also doing the quite painful, arduous, just literal work of like figuring out those parts of that set of 10 that do not come naturally, that need tons of practice, that need great professors, that need great models that you only can get through reading obsessively. And for me, structure was my absolute weakest point. I just did not have an intuition for that. It felt like a mystery how anybody figured out what plot or structure could be. And because I had that awareness that I was terrible at it, I became an obsessive student of it. And I would plot every single thing I read. I would do plot diagrams. I read tons of books about structure. I did like these really absurd drawings of what I thought was happening, like how tension was building. And I just treated it like a dissertation where I was like, this is what I do, is I just study structure obsessively until, of course, like, I learned a lot about it. So then I could apply that to this book and make really purposeful choices. And I think that one of the things that I've learned, one of the greatest compliments that I've gotten from people is that several people have said that they've read this book kind of quickly, that they like wanted to know what happened next. And I think that that's very meaningful because the content of the book is like a little lady looking at, some palm trees. That's not like the most suspenseful content. But if you can figure out how structure works, you can actually make anything feel propulsive And so that was something that was really crucial, was like, I wanted the freedom to write about whatever I wanted. And structure actually gives you that freedom. It doesn't constrain you. It doesn't like limit you. It actually makes any story possible in a way that a lack of knowledge about structure or pacing turns a story into like drifting mush. And so that was like, but that was just something I really had to like sit down and work very hard at. Yeah.
Hello,
Hi.
can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Um, how did the Pulitzer, being a finalist of Pulitzer, how did it change you as far as career-wise, writing, financially? Like, how did it, was it a boost, for you?
Yes. Huge. You know why? Because my Midwestern relatives have heard of the Pulitzer. So a lot of what you do in your life, maybe you've had this experience, is you go to like parties or you go home for Thanksgiving or something, and somebody says like, "What do you do?" And you go, "I'm a writer." And they go, "What do you do though?" And you're like, "I write." And they're like, "But for money?" And I was like, "Yeah." And then they'd be like, "That's so cute. But like, what do you actually do?" And then you say Pulitzer and they're like, "Oh, you're real. You're real." That's like, a legitimizing word. And so does it actually change anything in my writing life? Does it make the writing easier? Absolutely not. Like nothing has ever made the writing easier, but it is just sort of like a frustrating truth that like this thing that we're doing as artists is something that's not always recognized as having a value to everyone around us. And so having certain legitimizing like words around you just sort of clears certain like psychic debris out of your way. Like just the ants that are like, when are you going to get a real job? And I'm like, well, I have a book. I teach at Columbia. Like they're like, oh, Columbia, I've heard of that. That's real. And then I'll be like, Pulitzer. They're like, yeah, that's it. So it's sort of nice in that way of like clearing psychic debris. Yeah. But there's no money. They don't get any money for it, especially if you lose, which I have twice. But here's my goal. What do you think about this? I've lost in 2 different categories as finalist twice, and I lost both. My goal is actually never to win. My goal is to lose in like 10 different categories, which I think is a much more interesting like bio. Like if Meryl had gotten up here and been like, Chloe won the Pulitzer, you'd be like, oh, that's cool. But if she got up here and she was like, Chloe lost the Pulitzer in feature writing, memoir writing, plays, criticism, novels, she's really close, but never good enough. Like, wouldn't that be wouldn't you be like, I'm interested now, So that's my goal. What should I start with next, do you think? What do you think? Fiction. Okay. I'm going to write a pretty good, but not good enough novel. Robert will help me. And I can't wait. I can't wait to lose all of major American awards. I hope to lose them all.
To the structure question, in all of your like studying and reading, were there any resources or books you found particularly helpful?
Yes. Okay. I'm going to give a very truthful, but predictably nerdy answer, which is the most important structure book to begin with, not to adhere yourself to, but to begin with, is Aristotle's The Poetics. Any screenwriter will tell you that Aristotle's The Poetics is one of the most helpful sort of ideas. I mean, it's our first work, extant work of literary criticism, and many of the rules that Aristotle puts forward to try to create, for him, the ideal plot that creates catharsis, Many of those rules are awesome and very relevant rules that are meant to be interpreted and broken, but are helpful to understand. So that's a classic. I mean, another, this is very predictable, but truly useful, is Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey, or the book is actually The Hero with 1,000 Faces, but the quest structure that he elucidates in that is extremely helpful. Claude Levi-Strauss's Morphology of the Folktale, which is a taxonomy of folktales, which gives like a very incredibly like anthropologically based view of how people across time and culture and geography have told stories actually very similar ways. So when you get this sort of taxonomy of the folktale, like it gives you certain beats. Those are very helpful books. I mean, I think there's also like a lot of screenwriting books that are pretty good. You know, there's some more contemporary books. I can't remember her name right now, but it's called Meander, Spiral, Explode. Do you guys know this book? Her name went right on my head. I think it's Jane somebody. Jane, what's her name? It's a great book. If she ever watches this YouTube, I'm sorry. Your book is, she'll never find me. I'm so sorry. Your book is so good. That's a great book. That's really sort of more interesting structural things. And then Vivian Gornick's The Story and the Situation. It's very much about memoir writing, but I think that what she says about good storytelling is relevant regardless of what you're writing. It's relevant for journalists, fiction writers, nonfiction writers. It's a very slim book. I've reread it many, many times. It feels like a lifeline to me when I feel lost in purpose. So that's a few that I think are incredible. Yeah.
We have time for one more question. Or we can thank Chloe for a wonderful work.
Thank you so much.